or if your dog may be going deaf, if they're an elderly dog. So a surefire way, of course, is to get a Bair test. So a Bair test is, let me get the word here. It's the brainstem auditory evoked response. So this is, you go to a vet, they hook up some needles to their ears and at the top of their head, and then they put some earphones in there, and they send waves through, some sound waves through, and then they have a little thing that on a graph that shows them if their brain is actually getting any activity. If it's flat, they're deaf. If there's activity, they're not. Sometimes they can be unilaterally deaf, which means they're deaf in one ear and not both. So that's like a surefire way to do it. There's not very many places that actually offer these tests though. From my research here in Oklahoma City, Greenbrier Animal Hospital here in Oklahoma City, they offer it now, as well as Blue Pearl up in the Edmond area, they offer it as well. But then the only other place is in Elgin, Oklahoma. That's actually where I took my dog to get his test when I first got him. They were the only place offering it, and that's like an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. So OSU was offering it up in the Tulsa area, or Stillwater area, sorry. But they don't have it anymore. So the doctor that was doing it there, he retired, and they have nobody that's replaced him at this point. So, of course, you don't have to do that. Generally, you can have a pretty good feeling as to whether or not they're deaf by just doing some at-home testing. So, if they're snoozing or something like that, you can do some clapping, do some sort of kissing noises or something like that, just maybe tapping some pans together just to see if they're waking up. You can also do that when they're not asleep, just in case you're spooking a dog that isn't deaf, right? When they're just not facing you, like if you're having tons of trouble getting their attention when their back is, to you and they're not looking at you. That was one of the things that got me interested when I first got my dog, was like, okay, I'm having a really hard time training this dog his name, and I just thought I was doing things wrong. No, he just didn't have hearing. So ultimately, it's pretty easy to kind of figure that out. And of course, dogs that are going deaf, it can be a little harder because sometimes they can still hear a little bit, so they may respond, at sometimes, but not always. So when it comes to elderly dogs, sometimes it's better to just go get a Bair test somewhere so that you can actually see the graph, see how much hearing they do or do not have. Like I said before, it can be one ear that's actually losing hearing and not the other. They may have an unequal amount of hearing in each ear. So generally with elderly dogs, it can be a lot easier just to kind of go and get that test done. And it usually only takes like 5 to 15 minutes depending on the setup and what they're doing and how much stuff they've got going on. And it's generally not too stressful for the dog. I know for my dog, they just gave him some medicine to put him to sleep, and he was asleep the whole time and just woke up and was perfectly fine, didn't even know anything happened, and we knew he was deaf at that point. So moving on, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was how to communicate and actually train with a deaf dog, right? So I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about clicker training or marker training. It's basically using some sort of sound, whether it is a physical clicker or a verbal marker that basically tells them like, hey, that was exactly what I wanted, here's a piece of food for it, right? Well, with deaf dogs, we can't just say that, we can't use clickers, but we can use visual cues. So generally, you can use thumbs up, tell them like, hey, that's what I wanted. We have to do the same conditioning process, teach them like, hey, this signal means that you're gonna get a piece of food, and then start implementing that in the training. Some other trainers will use different hand signals. I know that Terry Hayward, she's a very popular deaf dog trainer. She uses a flash with her hand like that. And you really could use whatever you wanted. You just have to be super consistent about what that hand signal is. I usually stick to the thumbs up because it's pretty easy to do. And you can have treats in your hand and still put your thumb up. So it makes it a little bit easier in that regard. Moving to the type of training with deaf dogs, and I generally do this with all dogs, but lure and reward training is generally how I get dogs to learn hand signals. Right, so basically, just using a piece of food to manipulate them into certain positions, right? You're kind of luring them back into a sit or getting them into a down. And then you slowly phase the treats out and kind of get them to do hand signals that kind of looked like the beginning stage, right? So now they're doing sits for a little hand signal like this, or, a down for something like that. Recall is usually like a hand over your head, maybe waving a little bit, things along those lines. So it's a good way to get started. And again, you can do that with any dog, but it's really, really good for deafies because then you just got a good way to phase them into hand signals, and it goes generally a little bit quicker. So let's see here. The other thing that you can do with deaf dogs too is tactile cues. So this is, little touches, and you can break this down a lot actually. You can do touches on certain body parts. You can do touches, on their nose, on the back of their head, on each hip, and specifically train those to be certain cues, right? So I know that a lot of deaf and blind dog trainers, they have to use tactile for everything, right? So they'll train them, swipes up their chest means something versus, a swipe down the left leg versus a swipe down the right leg, or little just taps on their butt, something like that. That's a pretty general one that we use, is just try to get their attention, get them looking at us. We'll just teach them, a little tap on your butt means, hey, turn around and look at me real quick. So those are always something that you can use too, especially if you have a dog that may be also going blind. So definitely something to keep in mind with that. You can also use their peripheral vision, right? So dogs actually have a wider field of vision than we do. It's not, 180 degrees, but it's pretty dang close. And so they can see stuff on their sides a lot more. And so I'll constantly, if I'm not like super near my dog, but I can get to his side a little bit, waving your hands to try and get their attention, and teaching them that pays off, right? Teaching them that they can get paid for that, and that, especially if they come over to you, it's always a big bonus, right? But those are some of the easy things in regards to, working with your dog, communicating with a deaf dog, getting their attention, and ultimately using the same kind of training principles that we would use with any normal hearing dog in regards to marker training and lure reward stuff. So that's pretty much all I had. It was just a quick discussion about that. Do you guys have any questions that you wanted to open up about deaf dogs?
I do. All species, anything particular from like a shelter standpoint? I know that we always hear like, oh my gosh, that animal was white and has blue eyes, so they are obviously deaf.
Okay.
Are there anything else that we should be like monitoring for on dogs that maybe don't fit that stereotype?
So there is a huge proponent of like white and blue-eyed dogs that can be deaf. It's not a guarantee, but generally it's basically tied to a genetic difference, right, in which they don't produce as much melanin. And so that melanin causes the white fur and causes the blue eyes, but that genetic, what am I looking for? That piece of genetics is also tied to their ear development, right? So ultimately they don't fully develop their ears, and that's usually gonna be your dogs that are born deaf, right? So there's not really a whole lot else to look for other than your general, like doing some of those testings, right? And in a shelter environment, it's gonna be hard, right? Because it's so loud anyways. And maybe it's easier because they're just sleeping through all of the craziness. I know I work at a shelter, or not shelter, I work at a daycare right now, and there's an older bull terrier guy that he can sleep through all the madness because he is going deaf. He is clearly going deaf. So that's kind of one of the things you can look out for, is just, are they sleeping through all of the mad barking and stuff like that with no problems? Otherwise, kind of the same stuff, right? Running little maybe hand clapping tests when you do have them one-on-one and their backs are faced to you. But yeah.
Do shelter dogs do deaf dogs arriving in shelter facilities have equal levels of stress than their hearing counterparts?
I couldn't tell you for sure. I would assume not, though, just because they don't hear all of the mad barking going on, right?
Yeah.
Especially if they're in like suites that are blocking off the visuals and they're not like seeing the other dogs going crazy and doing all the spinning or whatever they may be doing with their kennel stress behaviors. So I would assume that they have a much lower level of stress than the other dogs, but I couldn't tell you for sure. I don't even know if there's data on that in any fashion, but my assumption would be that they have a less level of stress, or a smaller level of stress. So. Anybody else?
Can deaf dogs like sense any kind of like vibration?
Absolutely. Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah.
They usually, those senses I've noticed are very much heightened compared to other dogs.
Yeah,
Like, I can tap my foot on the ground with my dog and he'll feel it and turn around. It's something we've worked on actually. So they can totally feel that, absolutely.
Have you noticed a pattern in behavior struggles with deaf dogs versus dogs that can hear? Like they're more common in deaf dogs?
Startling is for sure one. Other than that, not really. But startling is definitely one that can be a little bit more common, right? Because if you sneak up on them, right? And that's why I'll do a lot of like coming up from behind and training them that like, hey, when you get snuck up on, you're getting booed. It's not anything to be spooked about. But that can definitely be one that happens a lot. They just can't hear you coming up on them, and so you might like, oh my God, what are you doing? Like I didn't know that you were there. So that can definitely be one of the problems that we see.
about with like compulsion issues, like obsessive compulsive issues?
That's actually, yeah, good reminder there. So yeah, obsessive compulsive disorder can be something that deaf dogs get a little bit more easily. I'm not exactly sure why that is. It could be something with the genetics there going on, but my parents actually have a deaf dog that has a canine compulsive disorder. And so if she's not on her medication, she is punching the ground with the various like reflections of the lights and shadows and stuff. She's constantly chasing until she's tired. And then as soon as she wakes up, she's back at it again. Like it's really bad if she's not on her medication. So that can be something else that you see. Obsessive compulsive disorder in dogs can manifest as like self-mutilation, like they're chewing themselves to, basically to, bleeding, and no fur. They can do spinning. It can be light chasing a lot of times, maybe fly snapping and stuff, like obsessively, even if there's not stuff flying around. So those are just some of the things that you can see with obsessive compulsive disorders in dogs.
Do deaf dogs have a higher vocalization?
I haven't noticed that. So my deaf dog definitely vocalizes a lot. He's not mute by any means. So they will use that to their advantage, just like any other dog. If they find out that barking works to get your attention and barking works to get stuff done, they will do it for sure. But I haven't noticed any deaf dogs being more vocal than just your normal dog. So.
What about less?
I'm sorry?
Less vocal?
Honestly, I haven't noticed that either. Yeah. So I think that's just kind of the same across. I could be wrong, right? They may do some studies about that and figure that out. But in my experience, haven't noticed anything in that regard where they're less or more vocal than other dogs. So I think that's more of an individual dog thing and maybe their breed makeup. So.
I have a follow-up question to that.
Okay.
Do deaf dogs vocalize their, like, do they growl and stuff the same?
Yep. Generally speaking,
So, like,
they're
how
going to have
do-
the same type of body language and maybe the same sort of like behaviors that
Like
lead up to
escalation.
aggression and fear and stuff like that. So they definitely will still growl. They'll still snarl and all that stuff. So that's going to generally be the same. Yes, sir.
Does missing any senses affect the temperament of a dog?
Outside of maybe the fear thing, like we talked about, being spooked a little bit more easily, that's generally the one that I'll see more common. I've not seen really anything else in regards to the temperament. So that can be part of it in regards to like being deaf, is they can be a little bit more spooky. But other than that, I haven't seen any major differences in temperaments. Most of that stuff is still going to be breed and the individual, and then how much learning and stuff that they've had and what kind of environments they're being put in. So.
I have a question. So, I have an example first. We had a potential adopter come in who did not declare that their dog was deaf, which is why I'm thinking of this. When you're doing a meet and greet with a dog versus a dog, or a dog you meet in public, are the dogs aware that there's a handicap, or is there do they communicate that there's something?
I've not noticed it with deaf dogs. I've seen it with other things, like dogs that maybe have movement issues and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And dogs can definitely pick up on that. But I've not noticed it that they have, and that they know that the other dog is not hearing them. Now I have seen, like my dog, he loves other dogs, and he doesn't necessarily hear the other dog's vocalizations when maybe they're trying to tell him off and tell him to stop. So that can be a thing that I'll see. Like he just doesn't hear them communicating. So unless they're really showing teeth or pinning him down or something like that, that can be a problem. But I haven't seen, other dogs kind of know that this dog is deaf. So.
How do you navigate the deaf dog learning those, or just mainly focusing on dog body language instead of the verbal communications that other dogs do for those?
I'm sorry, can you ask that again?
For deaf dogs, how do you navigate stressful situations and making sure that they're understanding the other dog's actual body language, since they can't rely on verbal cues whenever another dog is
Well,
upset?
dogs, their natural language is body language. So that's just usually, unless they're not properly socialized, right, then they're going to, if you're doing proper socialization with them, they're going to pick up on that stuff pretty quick. Because they're still right dogs. They're still going to communicate through their natural form of body language. So you generally don't have to worry about that. Now, of course, it's different for us because we're giving them verbal cues. Most dogs don't give a ton of verbal cues unless they are, barking or, growling or something like that. In those cases, you hope that the other dog is maybe providing some other sort of signals as well, maybe a lip lift or a snarl or something like that. Maybe, hackles raising, and that they start learning those are the cues. And if they're not, you just gotta be a responsible owner or handler and make sure that you remove them from that situation so you don't cause that other dog to have to blow up even more. But it's more difficult on our part really because we're so verbally oriented that, you know, we're just sitting there trying to get their attention when we know they're not deaf, you know, or we know that they can't hear. We're still trying to use our words to get to them because that's our first line of communication, right? So just making sure that you do a good job of teaching them appropriate hand signals and stuff like that, and making sure that you know, like, hey, I need visuals, I need you to be looking at me to kind of get some of that. That's kind of the big hurdle that people run into, kind of changing our habits around that.
How do you handle that when they're exposed to like veterinarian clinics?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
How do you handle,
Ironic.
or how do you guide, an animal who's like going into a veterinarian clinic, or maybe they're going to an event where an individual may be like poking and prodding them? Is there anything that we can be conscientious when we are handling them or exposing them to that?
So I would say that's pretty similar to any other kind of cooperative care or training for, you know, being handled. It's pretty much exactly the same, other than maybe the spook factor, right? You don't, as long as we can make sure that the vet or the vet techs aren't coming up behind them and, you know, trying to put hands on before they're seeing them. That way you're not accidentally, you know, creating some association that, hey, the vet and the vet tech and their team is spooky. They just came up and surprised me. So that's something that I would keep in mind, is making sure that they see the team in that regard before that they do any poking and prodding. Otherwise, everything else is going to be generally the same. And that's pretty much the same for all training when it comes to deaf dogs. The only thing different, right, is that we're using pretty much all visual cues, and we want to keep in mind the individual if they're a little bit more easily spooked. So, anything else, guys?
Have you noticed certain breed groups being more prone to being deaf than others? Obviously, other than old age.
So I know that Dalmatians are for sure. So Dalmatians actually have, it's like a 70%, it's a high percentage chance that they can come out deaf. It's just because of the way that their breeding lines went back in the day, and it caused a lot of problems with them. I've noticed it a lot in Staffordshire Terriers, which is ironic. That's my guy right here. He's a Staffordshire Terrier. My parents have a Staffordshire Terrier that's deaf as well, so I've definitely noticed that. But other than those two, I haven't noticed anything specific. It's mostly the color, right? You're gonna see if they're all white. That can be a big indicator. And it doesn't just have to be white, by the way. It can be any lighter color. It's just the lack of the melanin in their system doesn't create darker colors and things like that. And that's also, like I said, part of their ear development process. So.
And double merle.
What?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the double merle, yeah. And the double merle can absolutely cause blindness as well, so. Anything else? That's all? Well, thank you guys.